Now, on 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app, O'Connor and Company.
A genius lived amongst us, and he left us yesterday at the age of 82. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys joining us now to discuss his legacy and what made him a genius. Music critic and contributing editor at Rolling Stone, David Wild. David, you got to know Brian Wilson, didn't you?
Yeah, I had a series of amazing experiences and stories, some of which I can tell, and I got to, and none of which were just only because I'm not sure some are appropriate for this day.
Understood.
He was wonderful, and
Yeah.
he did not disappoint, and said some of the funniest things I've ever heard. I don't know to what degree he meant them, but I like to think he meant a lot of them.
Well, listen, I just mentioned this a little earlier on the program. They were calling him a genius while he was creating. Usually you reflect and you say, oh, my God, that guy was a genius. They knew at the time in the studio, these hardened studio musicians who had played for all the greats all through the 50s and 60s, during a session, they would say, this guy is a genius.
Absolutely. I think he might have been like the first person rightfully marketed as a genius in music. Maybe Ray Charles beat him a little bit with the genius of soul, but in fact, it was really one of the many occasions in which I spent meaningful time with Brian was when the Beach Boys reunited with Brian and did the big sort of 50th anniversary shows and tour, and I work on the Grammys as a writer, so they came through that. But at one point, they asked me to come into the studio where they had recorded Pet Sounds with all of the guys and do a series of interviews. And it was so beautiful because after all the, negativity and arguments and, factions, every one of them was acknowledging Brian's genius because it's so glaringly obvious. How could anyone not acknowledge it?
So did the genius emerge solely like during the Pet Sounds process and when he stopped touring and really just sort of focused on the studio? Because a lot of people, I think, write off the early music, the sort of feel-good hot rod surf music, but if you listen to those songs, that's the genesis of what ended up being Pet Sounds.
Oh no, absolutely. I think musicians, if you were to talk to, I'm okay, but let's say like Stevie Van Zandt, someone like that would be able to explain that the genius was always there in terms of, he took whatever contributions Phil Spector made and sort of the early stuff, and as you said, the surf songs, right, all of it was touched by his musical genius. And then he just kept, just like the Beatles, and in fact, inspiring them and being inspired by them, he kept on innovating. And that's the thing that's remarkable is he just kept going until he probably, in like some sort of Icarus or some sort of Greek tragedy for a time, he maybe went too far or further than any human could. I apologize. I'm in Nashville today on business and walking around a very quiet park that the minute
that's
you
fine.
called got very
No,
loud.
we like the energy. It's good, and Nashville's
Okay.
a good place to be too if you're in the music biz. If I could. If somebody is not as familiar with it, they just think, oh, the Beach Boys and it's that Beach Boys sound. If they want to dive in, is Pet Sounds a good place to start?
Yes, and in fact, there's a documentary, I believe it might be on Amazon now for free, on the making of Pet Sounds, a classic album, and I push it only partly because I'm in it saying everything I wanted to say about that record.
Oh, cool.
That record, people, and sometimes people, I know there's sort of like, so many people have called it like the greatest album of all time, that there's like a school of thought of like, well, have people gone too far? And I'm like, I'm absolutely not.
It's really that good. It's really that.
Yes, it's perfect. And that's actually one of the things is that, like, I'm a recovering rock critic now. I really, a guy who writes TV shows, but as a recovering critic, I always think it's the most perfect album ever. Musically, like I go back and forth between Songs in the Key of Life by Stevie Wonder,
Oh yeah,
Revolver, Rubber Soul, and Pet Sounds. But I think most days I do settle on Pet Sounds, and God only knows why.
That's so funny. You got in there. Well done. It's funny. Sir Duke is one of the. It's the 8 o'clock theme for this show because it's our fourth hour after starting at 5 a.m. So we
have
appreciate our
excellent
Stevie
taste.
Wonder as well. The other thing that struck me about reflecting on Brian Wilson today and his music is, I was in Southern California in the 80s when I went to high school, and it was part of our soundtrack. But my kids were born in the 2000s, and my 23-year-old just got married, and they were playing Beach Boys music at her wedding. He was certainly of his time, but the music is timeless. Do you know what I mean? It's like you hear it and it's like, okay, yes, that's that specific sound from the 60s, but it's relevant right now today in 2025, and it will create an emotion in someone the first time they hear it.
That is such a good point, and I think about it with my two sons. I think there's a lot of things that I love that on some level they sort of go dad rock or whatever. But
Yeah.
Brian Wilson is not like, yeah, it's funny, like bands that I thought were cool. And in the 80s, there was a period where the Beach Boys maybe, weren't considered as cool. But I think in the streaming universe, like I have both of my sons absolutely worship the genius of Brian Wilson. In fact, I took my younger son I don't know if it was his 75th birthday. I don't know which birthday it was, but he played, I think, the Greek Theater, and it was one of those things, because there were nights as a live performer where Brian, would be a little off or not absolutely his best, but I think
Sure.
he was having a great time at his birthday and was singing his heart out and happy and smiling and happy to be there. And my son said, "This is the greatest thing I've ever seen."
Yeah.
And I think, yes, I think the greats don't get any less great.
So much, real fast, just on his personal life, so much has been said about his troubles and the depression and the psychedelic drug use, much of it inflicted on him by this Svengali-like evil person who called himself a doctor that tried to control his life for years.
Oh, I spent some time with the two of them. That was
Really?
That guy was a piece of work. And it's funny, like, if you had to pick out who was the crazy person, it wasn't Brian.
Right. Well, and I guess when he got through all of that, I mean, because there was a time when he was like, people thought he was kind of a pain in the butt, and he was. That's many geniuses who know exactly what they want are like that. How was he in these last couple of decades, reflecting, gotten through all of that, and now sort of at peace and sort of reflecting? Did he settle in, or was he always sort of that quirky dude?
He was a very sweet man, and I think in fact, one of those that time when I was with him and the whole band in the studio, at one point we were standing together and he pointed to a studio, like a sort of the studio wall, and goes, "That's where my dad pushed my head." And I thought, "Oh my God!" And I realized, I think he was a sensitive soul who was hearing his own, I think he was like, Stevie Wonder, who I know who's, much easier to have a long conversation with, and Paul McCartney, and there's probably, I could name Joni Mitchell, but I think he was listening to he was hearing a different radio in his head, in his heart, and I think part of it was a defense against being sort of brutalized. And you think about, there's a lot of bad dads in music history. I didn't know Murray, but I just talking to Brian, I think that was a big part of the story on a personal front. But ultimately, he became a father. He became, I think he settled in, and and we're sad because he's gone. And I'm very sad. But I will say, like, there was a time in the 70s when, if you would have told us which of our geniuses, which of our greatest artists are going to survive, you'd be very happy to see that Brian Wilson stayed productive, that his last record, one of his last records that I just listened to in my morning walk here in Nashville, I listened to a record called No Peer Pressure, which a lot of people don't know. And it was wonderful. And I think the last years of his life, unfortunately, the passing of his wife, I'm sure was, I know was very, very tough for him, and he's dealt with so much, just medically. But I do think he in the long run, it's an amazing success story. And for him to reclaim Smile, for him to, to find great musicians for him to come to terms with the Beach Boys, I was around helping a little on that Grammy special we did where they all sat together, and it's like, you know what? In the end, it's a great it's a victory of art and heart, and the music is so beautiful. This morning I also was listening to. I wrote the liner notes for a number of releases for him. One of them was a record of Gershwin recordings, and it really struck me. He's going to be in history. The reason why he only gets better and my kid loved him is he is now going to be like Gershwin. He's one of the greatest American composers of our time, and there's not many people that will be said about. And I normally lived very close to him and walked past where he lived often, and now I'm across the country in Nashville, and I'm listening to the music, and I still feel so close to him. So I don't think he's gone. The music he made will outlive definitely me, maybe even you.
That's right. Oh, and I think that goes without saying. David Wild, great stuff. And I love reading your stuff. I love hearing you when you're on the Adam Carolla podcast. Put your headphones back on. Put on those good vibrations and get back into your happy place. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. No, great to talk to you.